He is the Associate Director of International Security Studies at Yale University. Dr. Irwin is also an international historian who specializes in foreign affairs and decolonization. He's written a book entitled Gordian Knot, Apartheid and the Unmaking of the Liberal World Order, and is currently writing another book as well as a collection of essays. In 2010, Dr. Irwin was awarded the Stuart L. Bernath Article Prize by the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. His lecture topic today is on decolonization, genealogies of cultural diplomacy in an international world. If you could please join me in a very, very warm welcome, Professor Dr. Ryan Irwin. Thank you. Welcome.
How are you?
Yes, okay. We do have PowerPoint, so let's bear with me 1 second. Maybe Claire, if you can assist. You don't have
I will start.
Do you have an USB? Or
I do actually.
That would be ideal. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. 1 second.
Actually, it's my briefcase over there, but
Okay, where's your
that's fine. It doesn't. I don't need it.
No, we can. Over here?
It's right
right.
yeah, right on the desk.
Begin and we'll get it.
All right. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here today. To give you some sense, I think I have probably about 25 minutes of spoken text prepared. So if you get especially hungry, you're welcome to dodge out the back door. If you've got questions that I can't answer, please just bombard me after I'm done. I'm an historian, so my engagement with themes of cultural diplomacy is a little bit different, I think, than some of the people here. I'm not interested necessarily in policy recommendations so much as genealogies, what happened in the past and how exactly did we get here. So this is not a talk about cultural diplomacy so much as a talk about the context around cultural diplomacy. And the story that I'll be telling really is about global governance. It's about the emergence of a particular set of assumptions about culture and diplomacy during the mid-20th century. It might be relevant to one of the questions that was just asked a moment ago about the difference between public and cultural diplomacy and how we think through those things. So I'll start with an individual. His name's Wendell Willkie, and if the PowerPoint works, then he'll be displayed right there very prominently. He wrote a book in 1943 called One World, which in some ways was the 1940s equivalent of Francis Fukuyama's End of History or Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. The phrase One World and references to Willkie were ubiquitous in the 1940s. In eulogizing him, he died unexpectedly in 1944. The Times explained his legacy and his argument fairly well, saying that he, quote, he believed that the international issue was the central all-pervading issue of our time. It was not just about the military, it was about the economy. It was not merely political, it was moral. It involved education, free speech, communication of ideas, trade, exchange rates, tariffs, standards of living. We cannot survive, he believed, unless we see the world as one. We need to see all of its issues as one. That's fine. He was a very good-looking man. He would have been a wonderful addition to the... the talk that I'm going to give is actually framed by two observations. First, this one-world idea, ubiquitous in the 40s, was linked to an ideology of American liberal internationalism. One of the things that I'd like to talk about is the meaning of American liberal internationalism. At the end of World War II, President Truman often cast the concept in purely functional terms. This was about carrying out the ideas of Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, which for him meant the ratification and promotion of the UN Charter and the World Court, which is revealing in its own way. The one world idea was institutional, first and foremost. It flowed from the view that the nation state was the primary organizing entity of global affairs, an agent of economic development and a mouthpiece for people. The United Nations brought nation states together to further this cause of development, to negotiate practical solutions to interstate conflict, and to punish those nations that threatened world peace. A second observation. Washington policymakers, at least, no longer believe in this brand of liberal internationalism. And the story of why is also something that I'll be trying to introduce today. Anne-Marie Slaughter, who just until recently served as Barack Obama's Director of Policy Planning at the State Department, recently wrote, quote, even as a liberal internationalist ideal, the United Nations is infeasible at best and dangerous at worst. It requires a centralized rule-making authority, a hierarchy of institutions, and a universal membership. Equally to the point, efforts to create this system, this order, have already failed. The United Nations cannot function independent of the major powers that compose it, nor will these nations ever cede their power and sovereignty to an international institution. Which is not to say that liberal internationalism has ended. It's to say that the assumptions that once undergirded culture and diplomacy have changed. Explaining this arc, or figuring out the riddle of what happened between the 1940s and the early 2000s, has been the focus of my own research. And again, if I was more tech savvy, there's a wonderful, you can actually use this, Hillary Clinton's advisor for innovation is a guy named Alec Ross, and he's been all over the internet, everywhere really you look. All you have to do is just Google his name. And he sort of is also very interested in this arc that I'm talking about, and advances an argument that I think is probably in the mainstream, at least in the current administration, that technology is the driving force here. That diplomacy was done a particular way for a long period of time. It involved diplomats going to places, negotiating treaties and bringing those back. The telegraph changed all of that, and now the internet is changing it all once more. And so the United States needs to rethink the meaning of liberal internationalism in this world. If I had to distill my own argument today down to a single word, it would be no. There's no question that technology has played a major role in remaking the way we think about diplomacy and culture in the 21st century, but politics matter. In a nutshell, I'd like to suggest that the politics of decolonization, specifically the politics surrounding the growth of the nation state, explains the arc that I've pointed to here. Or to put this point more bluntly, decolonization explains why the United States moved from a model of cultural diplomacy that was grounded firmly in the universality of the nation state to a model that seeks to use technology and other means to directly connect governments to local communities in other countries around the world. Proving this thesis requires an answer to a fairly simple basic question: why is it that the nation state became the alternative to the status quo in the mid-20th century? Now, the nation state is typically discussed as an entity born from Germany in the mid-19th century, and I'd like to make a revisionist claim. The term nation state with the hyphen between it actually does not appear in an English language dictionary until after 1952. And I'd like to suggest that the nation state, as it existed in the minds of people like Willkie, emerged from two overlapping milieus. The one was the Great Depression. The logic of classic political liberalism, where governments promoted mostly laissez-faire economic policies and negative rights, which of course was advanced against the backdrop of the high point of imperialism, buckled during the 1930s. And this happened across the Western world. In the face of high unemployment and political instability, governments invented new programs designed to provide their citizens with economic protections. This was done in an ad hoc and a highly experimental manner through the 1930s, but these experiments nonetheless transformed notions of what states could and should do vis-a-vis their nations. Preliminary conclusions, advanced by people like John Maynard Keynes, hardened against the backdrop of World War II, which is the second milieu. The conflict itself was a sprawling high-stakes playground where experts and engineers had unparalleled leeway to mobilize resources and rationalize economies. And the act of waging that war, this enormous effort at home and abroad, left an entire generation confident that states had the power to solve large and complex social and economic problems. By the end of World War II, the logic of laissez-faire liberalism was being replaced by something new, at least here in the United States. What emerged was an activist state committed to the economic and social well-being of the nation. If the power of this state could be harnessed in the name of progress and directed away from war, then the horizon of possibility was seemingly endless. It would be possible for engineers and social scientists alike to implement programs that would rebuild war-torn societies, end unemployment and hence the rationale for further conflict, and uplift people still under European tutelage. This was something that Russians and Americans could agree on despite their specific disagreements about the future of, say, Eastern Europe or Poland more specifically. And it's not a surprise that this vision is what created the bedrock, the cornerstone of the organization that we're in right now, the United Nations. The logic of cultural diplomacy in the 40s was fairly straightforward. Nations were internally bound units shaped by a common culture or a common personality, and the state's obligation then was to provide progress through cooperation. This was a vision of internationalism that cast sovereignty as bureaucratic interdependence, both at home through the state and abroad through the United Nations. There was no more room here for outdated imperialism in this mental schema. Not every nation was yet ready for statehood, but independence, again, in a system where nation states existed in an interconnected superstructure based on U.S. values, was inevitable. Soon enough, the system would expand. And indeed, it expanded fairly quickly. Alongside about a half dozen other South Asian territories, India entered the United Nations in the late 1940s. At first glance, India shared much in common with this uniquely American world order. Like the United States, India had emerged from the experience of British imperialism. Jawaharlal Nehru, the country's first prime minister, believed in the importance of economic development and industrial growth, like Americans, or like these American social scientists, and felt that the state could, in fact, plan its way out of poverty in a place like India. But India faced an unusual problem. Its nation was bigger than its state, partly because of the policies of British imperialism, as well as older migration trends. Indian people were spread through East and South Africa. They were in Europe, and they were in enclaves throughout the South Pacific. Yet the Indian state, established through the political process we call decolonization, held jurisdiction only in South Asia. This was an existential quandary, and it helped orient India's own understanding of internationalism during this period of time. If India could transform itself into the moral lodestar of the United Nations, then it would be able to promote a universal code of conduct for all the nations within that organization. And this code of conduct, which all nations would have to adhere to if they expected to remain part of the international world, would safeguard the Indian nation wherever it happened to be. Just under the surface, of course, the issue that we're talking about is racism. India was trying to reconceive not so much the meaning of culture or the arena of diplomacy, so much as the stakes therein. Peace and progress weren't enough. The international community needed to embrace racial equality. And New Delhi's first diplomatic initiative, spearheaded by Nehru's sister, Lakshmi Pandit, involved putting the apartheid question on the General Assembly agenda, arguing that racial discrimination was such an abominable offense that it overrode the UN's stated commitment to Article 2.7 of the Charter. Cultural diplomacy needed to be directed toward this specific larger goal. Most new nation states that came into the international arena in the 1950s were created as Europe's Asian empires collapsed, and they held similar ideas about racial discrimination. On the surface, for instance, India and China had a similar rhetoric about nationhood, statehood, and international order. In 1954, the two countries came together to articulate the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which formally codified the relationship between territorial integrity and sovereignty, which renounced aggression and interference in other internal affairs of states, and celebrated equality and mutual progress and material progress as mutually constitutive goals. These arguments were at the heart of the 1955 Bandung Conference, where China's Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai worked closely with Nehru and other Asian leaders to articulate an Asian worldview that cast cultural diplomacy as the fight against European racism. But under the surface, China's attitude toward the nation state was slightly distinct. With a historical self-awareness that stretched back to the Zhou dynasty of 1046 BC, Chinese elites had inherited a vocabulary that imagined China as the center of world civilization, as the pivot not only of a regional economy that dated back centuries, but of an economic system that up until the 1750s was the world economic system. Whereas Indian leaders generally conceptualized independence as a stepping stone toward interdependence at the UN, Chinese leaders saw sovereignty as a return to this lost era of regional influence. Such a mindset, of course, was reinforced by the fact that China was excluded from the United Nations. If India's diplomacy was oriented by its odd relationship between its state and its nation, Chinese leaders faced an even greater challenge that in their minds Taiwan had their seat in the international community. Washington's decision to exclude Mao Zedong's government from the United Nations up through the 1970s put Beijing in a vulnerable position, and it helped create the lens through which, in the 50s and 60s, Mao viewed his revolutionary modernization programs at home, as well as American actions in Korea and Southeast Asia. And when approached in this way, Mao's decision to lean one way in the Cold War emerges in a slightly different light. The conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, which is what we typically think of when we narrate this history, is understood almost always from the perspective of the German question. But Asia mattered. It was the playground where post-colonial elites debated the nation-state and the raison d'etre of cultural diplomacy. As Nikita Khrushchev assumed power after Joseph Stalin's death in 1953 and turned his attention to Mao's demands for economic and military aid, he articulated a sobering analysis of where Moscow actually fit in this conversation about the nation-state. The USSR was falling apart. Its programs were failing everywhere, and the government was struggling to meet the very most basic needs of its citizens. The reason, in his mind, wasn't communism per se. It was Stalin. Stalin had militarized Soviet society. This was an argument that he made in a very famous address in 1956. And he nearly destroyed communism by distorting it in this way. If the Soviet Union could redirect the spending that it was going through from the military toward industrial programs and agricultural programs at home, then it might still be possible to save communism as a viable doctrine. But the prerequisite for this was ending the Cold War. This mindset, predicated on turning inward and renouncing the Cold War, set the stage, of course, for the very famous fallout between Mao and Khrushchev, the Sino-Soviet split. And it ran into two obvious problems as the 1950s turned into the 1960s. The first was Khrushchev's personality. He was very bombastic, and he tended to make exaggerated claims about what was going on in the Soviet Union. And he also used nuclear weapons as a form of brinksmanship, trying to end the Cold War on the best possible terms for the United States. The second problem, however, was context. Decolonization in southern Eurasia altered both the size of the geopolitical chessboard and the number of chess pieces in play for him, which came into focus almost immediately. 1956 in Egypt, for example, Gamal Abdel Nasser seized power that year and immediately set himself to the task of playing the superpowers off each other. His goal was fairly straightforward. It was to use Egypt's control over the world's most important toll booth, the Suez Canal, to push both the United States and the Soviet Union to give him as much economic aid for his own modernization programs as possible, as well as much military aid so that he could use that the military aid against his enemies, both within Egypt and elsewhere in the region. This was a clear example of the tail wagging the dog of a small state playing the big states off of one another, and it worked, but at a very high cost for Moscow. And Khrushchev's inability to police the demands of small powers, his unwillingness to say no, as this chessboard expanded and became much more complex, became the defining feature of his tenure. Suez gave way to Iraq in 1958, which gave way to the Congo in 1960, and culminated, of course, in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in each one of these cases, Khrushchev was faced with a client who promised fealty in exchange for guns or missiles. And this dynamic underscored, I think, the gap that separated the U.S. and the United States at the height of this thing that we call the Cold War. Beyond these bursts of opportunistic military assistance, the Soviet Union had almost no influence on this conversation about the nation state. And the United States was in about the exact opposite position. Despite fears that the Soviet Union had too many missiles, Americans never questioned the underlying logic that the nation state, integrated here at the United Nations and committed to scientific progress, could address Asia's rising expectations. Americans preached a theology of modernization during the mid-century. At home, liberals believed that they could use government programs to create a great society that addressed the needs of the poorest Americans. Abroad, these same liberals sponsored a cornucopia of development initiatives in the Third World during the 1960s designed to transfer Western technological expertise to places like India, increase and systemize horticultural development, and promote industrial takeoff in these places. This was not just done by the U.S. government. This was also done, the USAID, direct aid, regional initiatives. It was also done through the United Nations, the World Bank, the Food and Agricultural Organization, the WHO, all of which employed American-trained social scientists, people like Norman Borlaug, the founder of the Green Revolution, and Walt Rostow, who probably more than any other individual theorized that America's engagement with the world, or America's understanding of nationhood and statehood. The resulting observation, and this is argumentative, is inevitable or inescapable. The United States had soft power. The Soviet Union didn't. And discussions of cultural diplomacy, understandings of culture and diplomacy, largely revolved in this orbit or this conversation about what the nation state could be. The idea here was to promote peace and progress between and among nation states, first and foremost. When viewed in this manner, the sudden burst of new nation states in the so-called Black Atlantic, Africa and the Caribbean, represented a far deeper challenge to the United States than Moscow's clumsy intrigues in Cuba or Egypt or the Congo. Nearly 40 new nation states, new countries, emerged into this organization between 1957 and 1967. This was by far the biggest burst in the decolonization story. On the one hand, the rapid acceleration of decolonization represented the realization of the presupposition that developmental nation states were the universal alternative to imperialism, especially in the global south. On the other hand, the spread of small nation states in Africa and the Caribbean much different than the large polities of India and China, for example, pushed a pair of very difficult questions to the forefront of global affairs in the 1960s. First, how could a country that adhered to racial segregation at home lead an international community where the members were now mostly non-white? And second, would the logic of the nation state, where governments delivered economic progress to nations via scientific planning, hold as these polities themselves became smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller? Now, one side of the story is fairly well known. It's not a mistake that the United States embraced civil rights and voting rights legislation in the midst of this moment, of this transformation. But the other side, I think, the answer to the other question, I think, is still being debated. Consider Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah, the country's first president, was an ardent believer in state-led modernization, like someone like Nehru. As he looked at Ghana's ledger in the late 1950s, he saw a nation with a strong agricultural base. The region's cocoa plantations made it a profitable niche economy within the British Empire, but an industrial sector that was non-existent. Nkrumah's challenge was to implement policies that diversified Ghana's economy. He responded by pushing cocoa farmers toward horticulture so that the country could be more self-sufficient, rather than continuing the production of cash crops, and by taking out a series of loans to begin construction on the Akosombo Dam. The hope was that this dam would provide Accra with a durable source of energy, which would then facilitate the growth of a tin industry, which would then diversify Ghana's economy and help the Ghanaian nation-state achieve economic liftoff. In theory, the country would stand shoulder to shoulder with Great Britain within a decade. In reality, Nkrumah was out of office by a military coup in under 8 years. Why? Nkrumah found himself pinched on 3 levels in the 1960s. Although Ghana's overall agricultural production rose dramatically on his watch, partly because Nkrumah hoped to use the profits to help pay for the Akosombo Dam, the price of cocoa actually went down as the British Empire collapsed, as more and more countries turned to cash crops like cocoa to pay their own bills. The country simply ran headlong into the basic rules of supply and demand in a post-imperial, post-mercantile global capitalist system. As cocoa profits flatlined in the face of increased production, cocoa planters, longtime power brokers in Ghana, turned against Nkrumah and began criticizing his plans to diversify their economy and thus weaken the power that they enjoyed, all of which unfolded against the backdrop of rising debt to countries like the United States, which further eroded the government's ability to pay unionized workers in places like Accra. And the result, of course, was a slow-moving catastrophe that culminated in the mid-1960s. And in different ways, this same catastrophe, this same dilemma, faced nearly every leader in the Global South as they began implementing the modernization programs in the decade after independence. Something was wrong. The developmental guidebook, where states could simply deliver economic security to nations if they followed a standardized set of scientific policies, was crashing up against geography, history, and scale. And this was happening at the same time that the United States made the terrible decision to expand its presence in Vietnam, which transformed international perceptions of what the United States was about, as well as the efforts, the frustrations that these new states experienced as they tried to use an organization like the United Nations, for instance, to get rid of apartheid in South Africa and the limitations of diplomacy. The result was twofold, and it set the stage for some of the irony and some of the difficulty that dogs us when we talk about cultural diplomacy today. Most obviously, the optimism that surrounded the nation state began to decline in the 1970s, especially in the so-called Third World. In scholarly communities across Africa and Latin America, it was in this moment that intellectuals turned to dependency theory to explain the failures of developmental theory. At the level of statecraft, more and more leaders turned to economic nationalism to use their resources as weapons on the international stage. OPEC's embargoes, the early 1970s, in this moment. And among activists, new non-governmental networks expanded rapidly, connecting various movements together in a patchwork quilt of single-issue campaigns that lobbied very purposefully across national boundaries and wrapped their demands in overlapping, yet sometimes elusive discourses like human rights, individuality, equality, liberation. The specificity of the conversation about what the nation-state could deliver to people started to fade away in this moment. At the same time, these activists worked to replace post-war internationalism with a system of maybe what you call transnationalism. The United States moved away from some of the core assumptions that animated the system it had constructed only 2 decades earlier. The policy of détente, championed by Richard Nixon, was designed explicitly to deal with what Henry Kissinger called multipolarity, which was code for African decolonization, or the rise of these smaller and smaller political entities at places like this one. Ironically, Washington responded by moving closer to the internationalist vision associated with China. It moved deliberately to shift the nexus of global politics away from the United Nations and toward these strategically important one-to-one relations that it had with not only China and the Soviet Union, but also Saudi Arabia, Iran, South Africa, Israel. The idea was to develop influence with influential states and influential regions who are willing to be influenced. Simultaneously, Washington moved toward alternative modes of global governance, most obviously the formation of the so-called G6, which was done in 1975, and was a direct response to the economic nationalism that the United States was confronting in OPEC. And they began themselves to embrace alternative discourses that downplayed modernization theory in favor of things like human rights. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was the US ambassador in 1975, was wrapped up in this. And it was a very purposeful effort to shift the conversation about rights away from the nation state toward individuals in a way that would allow the United States to recapture the moral high ground in the international community. And I'll end here, because I am out of time, with simply the unsubstantiated yet provocative claim that we live today not in the post-Cold War world. We live in the post-70s world. And I think our lack of a genealogy, our lack of a narrative that comes to terms with that is one of the reasons why some of the ambiguities around cultural diplomacy continue today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Irwin, and I'd be happy to take some comments or questions. I see one already in the back, so we'll start in the back this time and then come to the front. If you could please approach one of the microphones and briefly introduce yourself. Thanks.
Yes, hello, I'm Ashot from Armenia, Yerevan Center for Democracy and Peace. As we see from last escalations, both in Syria and Iran, I am very interested in short cultural diplomacy solutions or remedies for both these problems, because Armenia is neighbor of Iran, and there is danger of both migrants, being attacked anyway by chance or whatever. So, and also there is a huge Armenian community both in Iran and Syria. So I would like to know more about that, your professional opinion. Thank you.
That's an interesting point. And I have to underscore, I'm not a I don't engage in policy recommendations in any capacity. I'll say this. This is an interesting against the backdrop of some of the stuff that I just said. In 1972, there was a book that was written by a Native American thinker who made the argument that in the 1970s, looking at the conditions that I put on the table here, the world, activists who are interested in making the world a better place, needed to move toward a model called the fourth world, was his argument. And it was tapped explicitly into the basic dilemma that you're talking about there. If the third world was about using the logic of modernization to deliver economic progress to new nation states throughout the international community, this fourth world idea was about understanding that indigenous people were spread throughout different places. And if you could come up with a model that was geared toward non-governmental collaboration, then you could start to perhaps create alternatives and create a new system that would deal with some of the problems or the limitations, perhaps, of the international system as it existed in the 1970s. So I'd say, again, in terms of cultural diplomacy and its own genealogy today and how we narrate that, I think this turn toward thinking about cultural diplomacy is something that non-state activists can be engaged in just as productively as state activists can. It has a story. It has an arc. And I think some of the perhaps what brings people together in rooms like this to talk about these themes come out of the frustrations of a previous generation that I've talked about here. So, other questions or?
Let's continue. I saw one here, please.
Thank you for your talk, Professor Irwin. I'm Matteo Shanna. I study history at Columbia, and I'm also trying to understand that idea, the longue durée of an internationalism. And it's tough to put two questions in a 30-second period. I'm trying to. I like how you try to depict the post-45 period as a nationalist backlash to internationalism in the third world, to use that term. And I was wondering what your take is on Mazzini and how he developed the idea of a nation state and the young Italians, and then coming to the young Europeans. Would you see that as like an early restraint on the nation state idea? And secondly, you're talking about the apartheid pretty a lot. What's your take on Jan Smuts and his role in the creation of the League of Nations and the UN?
Yeah, that's Mark Mazauer is a professor at Columbia who just wrote a book, No Enchanted Palace, on this very topic. Well, I'll start backwards. The problem with that book, I think, is that or that argument, which makes the case. It's actually a very provocative piece. I'm not sure if people are familiar with this. He's making the claim that he uses Smuts as Smuts is the leader of South Africa. He plays a major role in designing the initial argument about what the United Nations is going to be, and what Mazauer then does is use this to advance the claim. I'm speaking in broad brushstrokes here, that the United Nations is actually an imperial entity, that it was based on an effort by people like Smuts to codify their authority, pan-European authority, the imperial project as it existed in his mind, on a much larger scale. So the argument, the counterpoint to that would be that, of course, Smuts is not as influential as perhaps he thinks he is in the 1940s. And really, if you want to understand, I think, why you get the system that you get, I think it's much more fruitful to look at people like Ralph Bunche, Harold Stassen, a constellation of Americans who are really actually in the mud designing this institution. Because one of the things that the United Nations does that the League of Nations doesn't do is provide for a mechanism for membership to increase really dramatically. And of course, that's designed explicitly with the idea that nations are real, and that statehood is not going to be something that doesn't happen. It's going to be something that simply happens on a particular timeline. And that differentiates him from many of his British, South African, it differentiates the United States from these other visions of internationalism that are emerging out of the British imperial context. What was the first question again? Mazzini. Yeah, Mazzini's interesting. I mean, he's everywhere, of course. I mean, you look at these third world nationalists and the arguments that they're making, and they're quoting him on, to a tremendous degree. One of the things that I'm interested in, one of the things that gets written out if the focus is just on someone like Mazzini, is the importance of the United Nations and membership in that international community, or an awareness for many of these elites who come in to possess these things called nation states over the course of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, that their own military political power is not going to put them on any sort of even playing field with a country like the United States. But in participation in an organization like the United Nations might actually provide you not to reset the terrain of international affairs, but to advance more specific goal like the Indian goal, which is creating a set of universal norms that are going to allow for the Indian nation, wherever it is, to have some sense of protection. And I think that the way that this older language is then appropriated and rejigged during the mid-20th century, I think, is as interesting as the specific citation of an Italian theorist in an earlier age.
Is there a final question or comments? Yeah, please. Maybe the microphone here.
Yeah, thank you. Just wondering if you can explain to me how during the Cold War era, post-colonial era in most African countries, how the Cold War helped to destroy African states. I'm thinking of this. Most African countries were colonized either by the French or the British. Now, upon independence, those people who found themselves in power in those countries had either British or English training and backing also. Then the Russians had to find a way to counteract this by offering scholarships to a lot of Africans to study at the Patrice Lumumba Friendship University. During those periods, those people were also given this ideology of socialism, or socialist ideologies. And then they went back to their various countries and began to war, in quotes, against the established capitalist philosophies that were on ground. And these gave rise to squabbles and conflicts. And most often when ideas that were not capitalist were floated, it became a reason to assassinate the president or the prime minister, whoever was there. Whoever was found to advocate contrary beliefs about governance. Maybe you take right from Togo, Congo, Nigeria, so many other countries, wherever you had a different idea about governance, it became a reason to sponsor assassinations of those who were in power. I give an instance. One president in my country, a military president in the 70s, I think, was said to have socialist ideas. He was a military president, but he believed in socialist values. And then the story goes that he had to be removed, he had to be killed. So some low-ranking military officer was brought in to stage an assassination of the president, and that he did. And this is the same story all over Africa, because of this, the desire to control by both the capitalist and the socialist bloc. And that seed, which was sown many years back, has continued to haunt the continent. I'm wondering what your take is on this. I'm not a historian, I'm a lawyer, but I try to think so much about some of these happenings. What do you think?
Yeah, in a very basic sense, I mean, there's been a lot of research. I mean, if you're looking at this moment of disillusion that I've sort of ended on here in the 1970s, two big arguments come out of it, right? One, corrupt African leaders were corrupt, and that's the reason why this didn't work. The other is that it was the Cold War's fault. So perhaps the CIA got involved in killing Patrice Lumumba and other people. I think historians are I could say that the efforts to actually dive into the record and try to reconstruct this and separate the memory and the narrative about this from actually what happened is a little bit more ambiguous and a little bit more difficult to wrap your heads around. And actually, there's a professor here in New York, Fred Cooper, who probably has the best argument about this. The notion that the gatekeeper state as a paradigm in Africa is probably the most intellectually fruitful and accurate way to understand why you get the outcomes that you do over the course of the 1970s. So I'll start right in the 1970s. I mean, imagine if you're someone like a Nkrumah or someone like him, and you've tried to implement these policies, and the outcomes have not necessarily resulted in the development that you were sort of led to believe would happen. What someone like Nkrumah faces is a series of stratified vertical relationships that he has in these post-colonial African societies, and the ability of African leaders in going into the 70s and 80s to maintain power in many of these countries. And this plays out in different ways in every single one of these countries, but the ability to stay in power for an extended period of time is about patronage. It's about balancing each one of these stilts to the best possible degree that you can. Now, that's a much different understanding, a visual image of what the nation state is. Suddenly, you get something that's visually sitting at the interface between a domestic society that is broken up between all types of different lines, and you could talk about that and come up with a vocabulary for that, and then an international community, and your ability to gain resources comes from your place at that interface. Through taxation, tariffs, and then take the money that you can get from that interface and then distribute it in a way that's going to simply keep you in power, keep the status quo running. People who can do that successfully stay in power for a long period of time. People who can't are cast out. That's it's a tremendously amoral, maybe is a better way to say it, understanding of what's going on in a place like Africa in the 1970s and beyond. The second, I suppose, the question of socialism, which is a good one to introduce. If you take, I've tried very purposefully to kind of jig the standard argument. We've got the Cold War argument, right? So the United States advances capitalism, and the Soviet Union is advancing socialism or communism. And I think to go back to some of the stuff that I talked about, I don't see that in the record. I think that if you define socialism a particular way, states delivering outcomes through planning for people, there's actually a lot of middle ground between what the Soviet Union and what the United States are actually advancing, what they're saying. The United States is doing it on a much bigger, more interventionist scale than the Soviet Union is, but they're actually adhering to many of the same core assumptions, and it are those core assumptions that kind of, again, crash up against the limitations of reality, the limitations of what you can actually achieve through state planning during the 1970s and 1980s. So I'll end on that spot.
Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Ryan Irwin, please express our gratitude. Thank you. Thank you very much. If you could actually maybe do that informally, because we're already pretty behind schedule, or is it a very brief one? Or?
It's very important.
Okay, all right. It's your time, but please, okay. Use the microphone, just make sure we get it on.
Sir, what do you think about the Mr. Cheney's one person doctrine and opening the door for deadly mistake?
Yeah, I think you could actually expand that. Like, where do you go from this argument that I've outlined here, right? And I think this is, if I say we live in the world of the post 1975. You've got this is what American politics are about. I think neoconservatism is about reinforcing or recapturing the tools of empire to govern the world in a different way. Hopefully something like cultural diplomacy is, trying to do something slightly different. But this is the big existential question: is if you understand the history as it actually happened, you narrate it, you take off the Cold War, and you actually understand this story, the nation-state story. What do you do with that? How it certainly puts things like Iraq and Afghanistan in a different light, and one makes you wonder if we haven't just kind of circled back to the very beginning of the 20th century.
All right, well, on that note, maybe a second round of applause for Professor Ryan Irwin. Thank you very much. So it's now 1:15, and I actually wanted to offer you all two special invitations. Today is our last day in New York, and as you all know, there's a very interesting expert who I've had the chance to work with for actually the last year and a half on and off, doing a fascinating project that I wanted you to at least learn about while you're here. It's Dr. Joni Cherbo. So if you would like, you don't have to, obviously you're free if you'd like to leave. I know you've been here, it's a long morning. I'd love for you just to learn a little bit about the work that she's doing, actually, which is a great example of cultural diplomacy in practice. She wanted to give a 10-minute presentation. We also have some multimedia. After that, as actually my colleagues in Berlin requested, they'd love to do another group photo. And one idea would be on the way, we could maybe take another photo where we did last night. There across to Berlin, there's this gun you may have seen outside where they've sort of folded it over, representing peace. If you all would like, again, you don't have to. We'd love after this presentation to just walk over there, take a group photo in front of that gun. We thought it'd be sort of cool with the United Nations in the background, as sort of a memory of the day. So again, it's totally up to you. We're reconvening at 3 o'clock, but for those who would like, we'd love to have the special presentation now from Joni Cherbo, and then also the group photo in front of the gun. We're going to try another group photo this evening, I think, at the end of the day. The problem is it'll be dark then, so I think now is really the best opportunity. If you do decide to do both of those things, you should still have at least an hour, if not an hour and 15-minute break for lunch. So I leave it to you, but I wanted to, at least since we're in New York all together on this day, to offer both of these opportunities to you. And I'd ask maybe Joni, if you wouldn't mind joining us right here front and center. I will say a few words of introduction. And I very much hope that many of you will benefit from the fascinating presentation we're about to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, Joni Maya Cherbo is an independent scholar. She's a writer, a researcher, and an educator who specializes in the field of arts and cultural policy. Dr. Cherbo has been a leading voice in U.S. cultural policy field. She served as the cultural policy coordinator for Americans for the Arts, the foremost national service organization that advocates and provides major research in the arts in America.